Well, I think we're ready. Welcome, Felcha. This is, what is it? It's August 9, 2020. Coronavirus is still with us. It's claiming more lives and making more people sick. Disrupting everything, everywhere. In the last, several months, I guess since March, I think, the virus has claimed another group of victims, which hasn't really gotten a lot of play in the media. And I'm speaking, of course, about gamblers, the people who make a living or have a passion about betting on sports. Sports betting now is legal just about everywhere, and it certainly didn't used to be the case. You used to have to go to Las Vegas to place a bet or offshore. And of course, the other option was to go to your local bookie. There was a bookie in my neighborhood when I was a kid. I lived in Detroit's West Side, and I didn't know it at the time, but he was a bookie, and his name was Phil. He owned a small store at the end of my street, right at the corner, and the sign on the store simply said, Phil's. My friends and I, when we were kids, we used to collect soda pop bottles and beer bottles in the alleys and elsewhere, and we'd take them into Phil's for the deposit money. And then we'd buy a candy bar or another bottle of soda pop or something, and we'd be happy. Now, Phil was always nice to us, and I later realized that it wasn't particularly because he liked kids. He welcomed us because we were his cover. As long as there were kids in the store, he had his cover. He had his front. If no one ever went into the store to buy anything, the police might get a wee bit suspicious. Of course, I didn't know that Phil was a bookie. I learned that later as an adult. I was sitting with my dad, and we were kind of reminiscing about the old neighborhood, and I mentioned Phil's, and that's when he told me, light bulb, Phil was a bookie. That's how he made his living. It wasn't selling candy bars to the local kids. But today you don't need to go to Phil's or a place like Phil's to place your bet. You can do it almost anywhere. It's legal almost anywhere. The problem, though, is not the legality of betting. The problem is since March, there's been almost nothing to bet on. People have been betting on the strangest things, at once basketball and hockey and everything else shut down in the spring. Belarus Premier Soccer, professional tennis, or professional darts. Those have been the subjects of people's betting over the last several months. Now, fortunately, we had professional basketball and professional hockey has opened up this summer. They're playing in a bubble, and things look reasonably well. Professional baseball is back as well, although things are a little more problematic with baseball. These teams are playing in empty stadiums and empty arenas, but that doesn't bother the sports bettors at all, because they can still make their wagers. The big issue now in the news is football, professional, in college, and to a lesser extent high school. It's hard to imagine fall in America without football. There are lots of issues, and the various leagues and organizations are trying to put this together somehow. A lot of universities have already said no to football this year. They've concluded that it's simply too dangerous for college kids to play football in 2020. And I don't disagree with that, but it does make me wonder if it's too dangerous for college kids to play football this year. How safe is it for elementary kids to go to school? Just wondering. Anyway, these thoughts about sports and wagering on sports just kind of reminded me of a story. And so I'll tell that story to you now. And it's a true story, or at least it falls in the category of a true legend. And it's a story about a hurling match in Ireland. It takes place at least 2,000 years ago, maybe even 3,000 years ago. I'm not sure which. And the story comes from one of the stories from the mythological cycle of Ireland, passed down generation after generation by Ireland's storytellers. The medieval, or actually pre-medieval monks tried to put these stories down in writing many, many years ago. They endeavored to make a record of these various legends. And these monks actually figured out the date of the story that I'm going to tell you. The hurling story I'm going to tell you takes place, according to these monks, on June 10 in the year 3303. And that year, 3303, may cause you to kind of scratch your head a little bit and be a little confused. That's because you're using the modern calendar. And according to my calendar, this is the year 2020. But these Irish monks didn't use the modern calendar. Under their calendar, year 0 was the year the Earth was created. And this hurling match was 3,303 years later. Now, by this calculation, the monks may have been off 4 or 5 billion years, give or take. But it can be expected because these ancient monks made this calculation many years before there were other sources of information, like Wikipedia, where they could have verified the date of the match. Now, these monks also figured out that the year 1626 was the year of the Great Flood. That was when humanity and 2 of every species was saved by Noah and his ark. So that was the year 1626. So this hurling match at 3,303 wasn't all that many years later. Now, any way you count the years, no matter what calendar you use, it was a long time ago that this hurling match that I'm about to tell you took place, and you can trust me on this. Now, this match was between the Fir Bolg and the Tuatha. Now, by legend, the Fir Bolg was the first group of people to settle in Ireland. It's actually not true. There were other groups there before, but that was the legend. Fir Bolg means men of lightning. And they were Hurling tribe, Celtic tribe. And they were one of the many Celtic tribes that roamed Europe for many, many centuries. And Julius Caesar wrote about this particular tribal group. And he called them the fiercest tribe of all the tribes outside of Rome. And he made a comment, and these are in Caesar's Chronicles. I forgot the name of his memoirs. But he said that these folks kept themselves free of merchants and other things which tend to effeminate the mind. That's what made him so fierce. Now, those are Caesar's words, not mine. But that was the Hurling. Now, these groups, the Hurling and the other Celtic groups, migrated out of Europe, mainland Europe, and into the British Isles. And this migration, you may call it migration, you may call it invasion, kind of depends on your point of view. But the Hurling became one of the most dominant Celtic groups in Ireland. The words Erin and Iri and Era and Ireland all come from this tribal group. And the Fir Bolg is what they called themselves, what these ancient warriors called themselves. Now, Tuatha means tribe of the gods. And this tribe in the story is likely a Gaelic tribe. The Gaels were yet another Celtic group in Europe which migrated or invaded Ireland. And the Gaels became the most dominant group within Ireland, and their language, Gaelic, supplanted all the other prior languages on the island. Now, the Gaels probably had a big ego, or else they would not have referred to themselves as the tribe of the gods. or perhaps other Celtic groups gave them that name. And there's less shame to losing a battle to the Gaels if you can call them the tribe of the gods. Certainly it's not as embarrassing to lose to the gods than it is to lose to another tribe. But in any event, when the Tuatha came to Ireland, the Fir Bolga was already there. And a battle between these two tribal groups certainly was inevitable. And the warriors on the two sides met near Cunga. Cunga means narrows in Irish, and it's in fact there's a narrow strip of land between two lakes, and that's Cunga. There's also a little creek there, which is kind of the boundary between County Mayo and County Galway, so you can figure out where Cunga is. The town is now called Cong, and it's the site for the filming of The Quiet Man with John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara, classic movie set in Ireland. But it wasn't as quiet there when the Fir Bolga and the Tuatha were there, when they met for battle. Now, the monks writing about this battle reported that the two armies consisted of over 100,000 warriors. Now, that number may be way overstated, and if one thinks about how the monks counted years, it may be off by 1 billion or 2, but in any event, the two armies were huge. And the armies met at Moytura, the Tower Plains, in June of the year 3, whatever it was, 1,000 years ago. And while the armies were readying for battle, the elders of both groups kind of met in the middle to discuss terms. And it's not at all clear whether they were discussing trying to negotiate a peace, or whether they were agreeing upon the terms of engagement. But in any event, they spent a lot of time on the plains talking about the future. May have been the future of the battle, may have been the future of Ireland, but they were talking interminably long. At least that was the impression of some of the younger warriors in the Fir Bolga. They got very impatient about these discussions. And so 27 of them went over to a nearby field, and they taunted the Tuatha, and they challenged the Tuatha to a hurling match. Now today, hurling is played with 15 players per team, but in this match there were 27 Fir Bolga players on the field, soon joined by 27 Tuatha players to compete against them. Now today the hurling match is played with rules and with referees. They're on the pitch to enforce the rules. A few thousand years ago, there were no rules and no referees. And today, the game can be rough. You can see today's matches are a lot of body contact, swinging hurleys, and fast-moving balls. I saw an old newsreel that described a hurling match as athletic manslaughter. Now, that may be a bit of an exaggeration for today's game, but it was quite accurate in the early forms of the game. It was positively brutal. While one player may be trying to score points on the pitch, another may be swinging his hurley at his opponent's head. Now, a modern hurley is a well-crafted instrument, but in ancient times it was often as not a shillelagh, or something equivalent to a shillelagh. And the shillelaghs of old were not walking sticks. They were weapons. They had a long stiff shaft, usually of oak. They had a hard, knobby end, often was part of the root of the tree or the branch. It was smeared in butter or lard and then cured by fire, and that made this knobby end, or the whole stick, but especially the knobby end, very hard, extremely hard. Now, the ancient warriors often did not have swords or battle axes even. They fought with, spears and arrows and so forth from a distance, but for closed-end contact, the weapon of choice usually was a shillelagh. It was the weapon of choice, and if you hit an enemy squarely on the head with the knobby end of the shillelagh, you could shatter bones and shatter a skull. Such was the force of that weapon. Now, the nice thing about a shillelagh to these ancient warriors is it could also be used not only as a weapon, it could also be used as a hurling match. And that's what the warriors did at Moitura. In the match, the hurley was sometimes used as a sporting device to move the ball around, and as often was used as a weapon to injure your opponent. Now today, a hurling match is I think it's like 60, 70 minutes. There's some variations. But then, a hurling match it took as long as there were players on one side who remained standing. Now this particular match between the Firbolga and the Tuatha ended in a draw. Now I'm not certain of the final score. I'm not sure that anybody kept score, but it wasn't recorded anywhere. But it was a draw, since at the end of the match, no one was left standing. None of the 54 players on the pitch was able to walk away. Many, it's recorded, were killed. By some accounts, all of the Firbolga was killed. But the pitch was littered with players, none of whom were able to continue. Nearly all had broken bones, and most were injured in a very, very serious fashion. So the game ended in a draw. And after that, and I don't know who the sports gamblers had bet on. I guess when it's a draw, the bet goes to the house. So I don't know who the house was that profited from this particular sporting event. But after the match, neither side was in a mood for further negotiation. And the day after the match, the battle began. And it was a brutal affair. And the first day was horrific. Thousands remained on the battlefield at the end of the day, too wounded or dead or exhausted to move. Those who left could walk off the field at the end of the day, went to their side, but nothing was decided. Firbolga went to one side, and Tuatha went to the other side of the field at the end of the battle. Now the second day was the same as the first. Warriors of Firbolga charged on one side, warriors of Tuatha charged on the other. They fought all day long. Thousands more had died. Thousands more were wounded. And at the end of the day, both sides went to their respective sides of the field. The field stayed littered with the dead and the wounded. Nothing was decided. Now, the third day of the battle, the same thing took place. The field was littered with the dead and the wounded. Nothing was decided. Absolute draw, except to the people who died in the battlefield. Now, the Tuatha came to the battlefield initially with far more men than the Firbolga. And this advantage in numbers finally had the effect on the fourth day of the battle. By midday, Firbolga retreated from the battlefield further enough away to end the battle, a Tuatha victory. Now, perhaps you might say the results would have been different if Firbolga had John Wayne on his side, but he didn't come around to this region till thousands of years later. Now, the elders of both sides met that evening and then negotiated a peace. And under the agreement, the Firbolga got Connaught, that kind of region, what was then that region of Ireland. It wasn't called Connaught at the time. And the Tuatha got the rest of Ireland. Now, there are many cairns at Moituara today, and these are piles of rock carefully placed together to stand for centuries. And it was said that the soldiers on each side, when they left the field at the end of the day, at least those who could walk, they carried a rock with them in one hand and the head of somebody they had killed on the other. And when they got to their side of the field, they carefully placed the stone and the head on a cairn. And these were placed together in a way so that people could remember the battlefield. Now, the field where the hurlers played is still called the Plain of the Hurlers. And I read a report, it was by a 19th century Irish archaeologist who said, kind of reminiscing or getting oral histories from people in the community, that hurling was still played there in the 18th century. Now today the field looks exactly the same, or you would have to assume it's exactly the same as it was way back then when the battle and the hurling match took place. Now this is, of course, Ireland I'm talking about. If this field were in America, I'm sure there would be a strip mall there by now, but not in Ireland. Now this field is no longer used by hurlers, or at least not by humans. The local fairies still play the game of hurling on this field, usually by moonlight. And local people often report a glow that they see from the field in a nearby cave by the field certain nights. And that is, in fact, a fire kept burning by the fairies in the cave. And in the cave is where the fairies have their banquet after a rousing game of hurling. So that is indeed the story. Hurling is indeed an ancient game. It was played by the Celts in ancient times. It's played today in Ireland and by sons and daughters of Ireland elsewhere in the world, less frequently, but still is played. And of course, it's still played by the fairies at Moituara. And I don't know what the line is for which group of fairies you should bet on. You can probably find an answer to that online. So that's the end of my podcast today. Don't forget to take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. Like and share my Facebook page, Clandonald. Just put Clandonald in the search function on Facebook and you can find it. Look forward to seeing you all in person in 2021. I've been spending the last couple of days trying to find who thinks they might be open for festivals and other events, live events in the year 2021. So I hope to see you then. But in the meantime, be safe, be smart, and do the right thing. So goodbye and shlan.